Have you ever been in a conversation and felt it right away? That quiet realization that settles in before the words are even finished. The moment when you know, without needing proof, that there is nothing you can say that will make this better. No clarification will land. No apology will satisfy. No explanation will be understood in good faith. You're not confused. You're not unclear. You're not failing to communicate. You're dealing with someone who has already decided who you are in this conversation, and they are not interested in updating the story. Most people don't talk about this plainly because it feels uncomfortable to admit. We like to believe that if we just say things the right way, if we choose better words, soften our tone, explain ourselves more carefully, eventually the other person will calm down, understand, meet us in the middle. That belief is comforting. It gives us a sense of control. But it also traps us because there are some people in some moments who are not looking for resolution. They are looking for conflict. They are not listening to understand. They are listening to react. And more than anything else, they are committed to misunderstanding you. This is one of the hardest truths to accept in communication, not because it's complicated, but because it challenges the idea that every conversation can be fixed if you just try harder. Some conversations cannot be won because the other person is not playing to understand. They are playing to assign blame. They are trying to cast a villain, and they have already picked you. When you're in these conversations, there's a specific feeling that shows up in your body. It's frustration mixed with disbelief. You'll find yourself thinking, that's not what I said, or you're twisting my words, or why are you making this into something it's not? And the more you explain, the worse it gets. The more reasonable you become, the more unreasonable the conversation feels. That's your signal. That's your cue that this is not a misunderstanding. This is a misalignment of intent. People who are committed to misunderstanding you are not confused. They are strategic. They might not be conscious of it, but they're driven by an internal need. Sometimes that need is control. Sometimes it's validation. Sometimes it's the emotional payoff of being the victim. Sometimes it's the comfort of feeling morally superior. Whatever it is, the misunderstanding serves them. And that's why clarification feels useless. That's why no matter how carefully you choose your words, they seem to find a way to hear the worst possible version of what you said. These are often the same people who escalate quickly. They jump from zero to accusation without pausing in the middle. They don't ask curious questions. They make declarative statements about your character, your intentions, your motives. They'll say things like, "You always do this," or "This is who you really are," or "I knew I couldn't trust you." Notice what's happening there. The conversation isn't about what happened anymore. It's about who you are. And once a conversation shifts from behavior to identity, it stops being a dialogue. It becomes a courtroom. In that courtroom, they are not trying to understand the facts. They're trying to win a verdict. And in order to do that, they need an enemy. They need someone to carry the role of the bad guy so they can justify their anger, their tone, their behavior. If they can push you into reacting badly, if they can provoke you into saying something sharp or defensive, then suddenly their behavior feels justified. See, they'll think, this proves it. This is who you are. Your reaction becomes their evidence. This is why these conversations feel so draining. You're not just responding to words. You're fighting a narrative that's already been written about you. And the more you try to defend yourself, the more you unintentionally participate in the story they want to tell. Here's the part that most people miss. The goal in these moments is not to convince the other person. The goal is to protect your integrity. You don't need to win the argument. You need to avoid becoming someone you're not in the process of engaging with someone who already is. There's a big difference between standing your ground and pushing back. Standing your ground means you stay anchored in who you are. You don't abandon your values, your tone, or your self-respect just because someone is trying to bait you. Pushing back, on the other hand, often means escalating. It means matching their energy, throwing something back just as sharp or sharper, trying to overpower them with words. And while that might feel satisfying for a moment, it almost always costs you more than it costs them. When someone wants you to be the villain, they want you to lose control. They want you to become reactive. They want your calm to crack because your calm threatens the story they're telling themselves. If you stay steady, if you remain clear, if you refuse to play the role they've assigned you, it forces them to sit alone with their behavior. And that's uncomfortable for them. That's why they push harder. This is where discipline comes in, not emotional suppression, emotional discipline. The discipline to say, I don't need to respond to everything that's thrown at me. The discipline to let certain comments fall to the floor instead of picking them up and swinging back. The discipline to recognize that not every attack deserves a defense. Think of it this way. If someone throws trash into your yard, you have choices. You can pick it up and throw it back, continuing the exchange. You can collect it and keep it, letting it clutter your space, or you can leave it where it fell and refuse to engage with it at all. Just because someone hands you something doesn't mean you're obligated to carry it. One of the most powerful internal phrases you can use in these moments is simple, I'm not going there. Not out loud necessarily, but internally. I'm not going there. It's a reminder that you get to decide where you place your energy. It creates separation between your identity and the conflict being offered to you. You're acknowledging what's happening without stepping into it. This doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you allow disrespect. It means you respond in a way that aligns with your values rather than reacting in a way that feeds their agenda. Sometimes that response is silence. Sometimes it's a calm boundary. Sometimes it's a brief, steady statement that doesn't invite debate. There's a maturity in realizing that some people cannot follow you where you're going. And that's not a failure. That's a filter. Not everyone belongs in every chapter of your life. Just because someone is present now doesn't mean they get to come with you into the next phase. Growth has a way of shedding what can't keep up. Think about it. Rockets don't reach space without shedding weight. Parts fall away during the ascent because they're no longer necessary for the next altitude. Relationships and conversations work the same way. If someone insists on operating at a level of hostility, manipulation, or disrespect, they simply cannot access the altitude of calm. Respectful dialogue you're choosing to live at, you don't have to force them to change. You just have to keep moving forward without dragging them with you. This is especially hard when the person is close to you. A family member, a coworker, someone you can't easily avoid. The instinct is to keep trying, to keep explaining, to keep hoping that this time it will land differently. But hope without boundaries turns into self-betrayal, and self-betrayal always shows up later as resentment. There's strength in deciding, I will be clear and I will be kind, but I will not stay in conversations that require me to abandon myself. That strength doesn't always look loud. Often it looks quiet, steady, unmoved. Another powerful phrase to carry with you is, I see things differently. Not, you're wrong. Not, that's not what happened. Just, I see things differently. It's a statement of perspective, not an invitation to argue. It communicates that you are not buying into their version of reality without trying to rip it away from them. You're simply refusing to adopt it as your own. When you argue perspective with someone who wants conflict, they'll usually double down. But when you calmly state your position without defending it aggressively, it takes away the fuel they're looking for. You're no longer pushing. You're standing. There's another phrase that's often underestimated because of how simple it is. That's disappointing. Said calmly, without sarcasm, it's incredibly grounding. It shifts the tone instantly. It communicates that the behavior falls below your standard without attacking the person's character. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't accuse. It simply names the gap between what you expected and what you're experiencing, and that gap matters. Because most of the time, when people treat us poorly, what hurts isn't just the behavior. It's the loss of hope. The realization that they're not showing up the way we believe they could. That's disappointing, honors that reality without turning it into a fight. Alongside that, there's one phrase that deserves to be said more often, especially by people who were taught to be agreeable, accommodating, or polite at all costs. I don't accept that. This isn't aggression. This is clarity. It's not about controlling the other person. It's about defining what you will allow into your space. You don't need to explain it to death. You don't need to justify it. You don't need their approval. I don't accept that is a complete sentence. It draws a line without turning into a lecture. It places responsibility back where it belongs. The power here isn't in humiliating the other person or proving them wrong. The power is in refusing to let their behavior rewrite who you are in the moment. When you stop trying to win over someone who wants you to lose yourself, you reclaim something essential. You reclaim your self-respect. True strength in communication is not dominance. It's restraint. It's knowing when engagement serves you and when it drains you. It's recognizing that your calm is not weakness and your silence is not surrender. Sometimes the most self-respecting move is to remain steady while someone else exhausts themselves trying to provoke you. And this is where it all comes together. People who want you to be the villain rely on your emotional participation. They need your reaction to complete the story. When you refuse to provide it, the script falls apart. You don't have to change them. You don't have to convince them. You simply have to stay aligned with yourself. Because at the end of the day, the goal of communication isn't to dominate every conversation. It's to walk away knowing you didn't abandon your character under pressure. And when you can do that, when you can look back at even the hardest conversations and say, I stayed true to myself, you realize something important. You didn't lose anything. You protected what matters most. That's where real confidence comes from. Not from always being understood, but from knowing you are even when you're misunderstood. One of the most important shifts you can make in your communication is learning how to recognize when a conversation has stopped being about understanding and started being about control. This shift is subtle, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. It often masquerades as intensity, raised voices, emotional language, urgency. But beneath all of that, there's a quiet change happening. The other person is no longer curious, they're no longer open, they've moved into a position, and that position feels righteous to them. When that happens, logic stops working, facts stop working. Even empathy stops working in the way you expect it to. This is the moment where a lot of people get trapped because they believe that if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, the other person will see reason. But reason only works when both people are reasoning. When one person has already decided the outcome, explanation becomes ammunition. Every additional word you give them is something they can twist, misinterpret, or throw back at you. That's why you have to learn how to spot the pattern instead of getting lost in the content. Content is what they're saying. Pattern is how they're engaging. Are they interrupting you? Are they skipping over your clarifications? Are they jumping from one accusation to another without resolving anything? Are they speaking in absolutes always? Never. Everyone, no one. Those are not the markers of someone seeking understanding. Those are the markers of someone reinforcing a narrative. Once you see the pattern, your role changes. You stop trying to fix the conversation and start managing your participation in it. This is a crucial distinction. You cannot fix someone else's need to be right. You cannot reason someone out of a position they did not reason themselves into. But you can decide how much of yourself you give to the interaction. This is where emotional boundaries matter more than verbal ones. An emotional boundary is the decision not to internalize what someone else is projecting. It's the understanding that just because someone is angry at you doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Just because someone is disappointed doesn't mean you failed. Just because someone accuses you doesn't mean the accusation is true. Most people struggle here because they confuse emotion with truth. If someone feels strongly, they assume there must be something valid underneath it. But emotion is data, not a verdict. Someone's feelings tell you about their internal experience, not about your guilt. When you stop trying to correct their feelings and instead focus on maintaining your position, something interesting happens. The conversation either de-escalates or it exposes itself. If the other person was capable of mutual understanding, your calm will invite it. If they were only interested in control, your calm will frustrate them. Either outcome gives you clarity. There's a quiet confidence that comes with not needing to be believed in every moment. This is especially difficult for people who value fairness. If you're wired for fairness, misunderstanding feels intolerable. You want to set the record straight. You want to make sure the story is accurate. But sometimes the cost of accuracy is your peace, and you have to decide which one matters more in that moment. This doesn't mean you stop caring about the truth. It means you stop forcing the truth on someone who isn't open to receiving it. You hold it without shoving it. You trust that your consistency over time matters more than winning a single conversation. There's a concept that helps here: emotional posture. Your emotional posture is how you hold yourself internally during conflict. Are you leaning forward, chasing resolution, trying to convince? Or are you upright, grounded, steady? When your posture is grounded, you don't rush, you don't over-explain, you don't fill silence with justification. You allow space. Silence is deeply uncomfortable for people who want control. They expect reaction, they rely on it. When it doesn't come, they often escalate or pivot. They might accuse you of not caring. They might say you're cold. They might try to provoke a response. But that reaction tells you everything you need to know. It reveals that the goal was never mutual understanding. The goal was emotional leverage. At this point, many people feel guilt creeping in. They worry that disengaging is unkind. That setting boundaries is selfish. But kindness without self-respect turns into self-erasure. You are allowed to care without collapsing. You are allowed to be empathetic without being absorbent. There's a phrase that helps anchor this internally: I can care without carrying. You can acknowledge someone's emotions without taking responsibility for regulating them. That is not your job. Everyone is responsible for their own emotional management. This is especially important when dealing with people who exhibit manipulative behaviors. Manipulation thrives on emotional reactivity. It feeds on guilt, fear, and confusion. When you remain clear and steady, manipulation loses its grip. Not because you outplay it, but because you don't engage with it. You might notice an urge to explain yourself one more time, to clarify that one misunderstood point, to fix that one inaccurate assumption. Notice that urge. That urge often doesn't come from clarity. It comes from anxiety. It comes from the discomfort of being misjudged. When you recognize that, you can make a conscious choice. You can say to yourself, I don't need to be understood right now to be okay. This is where identity becomes critical. When your sense of self is solid, misunderstanding hurts less. It still stings, but it doesn't destabilize you. When your identity is shaky, every accusation feels like a threat. Strengthening your identity isn't about ego. It's about alignment, knowing what you stand for, knowing how you behave under pressure, knowing what you will and won't do to win approval. The people who remain calm in chaos are not emotionless. They're anchored. They've decided in advance who they are, so when conflict arises, they're not figuring themselves out on the fly. They're referencing something solid. If you've ever walked away from a heated interaction and felt proud of how you handled yourself, even though the issue wasn't resolved, you've tasted this. That pride doesn't come from winning. It comes from integrity. Integrity in conversation means your behavior matches your values even when provoked. Especially when provoked. That's easy to say and hard to do. It requires practice. It requires self-awareness. It requires you to notice when your buttons are being pushed. Everyone has buttons. Pretending you don't have them doesn't make you strong. Knowing where they are makes you prepared. When someone presses a button, the question isn't whether you feel it, the question is what you do next. This is where the internal pause matters, that brief moment between stimulus and response. Most people miss it. They're already reacting before they realize what they're feeling. But if you can stretch that pause even slightly, you gain choice. You can ask yourself, what does responding right now cost me? Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the answer is everything. There's a powerful reframe that helps here. Instead of asking, how do I make them understand? Ask, how do I want to show up in this moment? That question shifts the focus from outcome to alignment, from control to character. When you orient yourself toward alignment, the pressure drops, you stop performing, you stop managing perceptions, you simply act in accordance with who you are. That might mean calmly restating your position. It might mean setting a boundary. It might mean ending the conversation. All of those are valid. Ending a conversation is not failure. It's discernment. It's recognizing that continued engagement is not productive. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need to explain yourself again. A simple, steady disengagement often says more than a long justification ever could. There's a quiet power in saying, I'm not going to continue this conversation if it stays at this level. Notice what that does. It defines your boundary without attacking theirs. It places responsibility back where it belongs. What happens next is their choice. People who are committed to misunderstanding often test boundaries. They'll push. They'll scoff. They'll accuse you of being dramatic or sensitive. That's not information about you. That's information about their discomfort with limits. Limits threaten people who rely on emotional overreach. When you stop overextending, the dynamic changes. You may lose access to certain relationships as they are, but you gain access to yourself. There's grief in that. It's okay to acknowledge it. Some people will not grow with you. Some relationships will only survive if you keep shrinking. Recognizing that is painful. But it's also clarifying. When you stop giving enemies to people who want conflict, you start seeing who they are without your reactions filling in the gaps. Their behavior stands on its own. And you don't need to point it out. You don't need to label it. You just need to decide what you're willing to engage with. Over time, this changes how people interact with you. Not everyone will respond positively. Some will fade. Some will adjust. Some will escalate. But you will be different. You'll be more centered, less reactive, less drained. And here's the quiet reward. When you stop fighting to be seen by people who refuse to see you, you create space for relationships that don't require that fight. Conversations become simpler. Conflict becomes cleaner. Your energy stops leaking. This isn't about being untouchable. It's about being intentional. You're not closing your heart. You're protecting it from unnecessary harm. You're choosing to invest your emotional energy where it has a return. The more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. You start recognizing red flags earlier. You stop engaging in loops that never go anywhere. You trust your instincts when something feels off, and you begin to understand something important. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-trust. When you trust yourself to handle whatever arises without abandoning who you are, conflict loses its power. That's when you realize you don't need to win against people who want you to lose yourself. You just need to walk away whole. As you grow into this way of interacting, you begin to notice how much of your previous communication was shaped by fear rather than choice. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being disliked, fear of losing connection. Those fears quietly guided your words, your tone, and even your silence. And because fear tends to speed us up, you reacted faster than you needed to. You filled gaps that didn't need filling. You took responsibility for emotions that were never yours to manage. When someone is on edge, that fear gets activated instantly. Their intensity feels contagious. You can feel it pulling at you, urging you to match their energy so you don't fall behind. But matching their energy doesn't bring balance. It brings escalation. Two nervous systems firing at the same time don't create resolution. They create friction. The work, then, is learning how to regulate yourself even when the other person is not regulating themselves. This is not about suppressing emotion. Suppression creates pressure. Regulation creates room. It allows you to feel without being overtaken. And that's a skill that has to be practiced consciously because most people were never taught it. Self-regulation starts with noticing the physical cues before the emotional reaction takes over. The tightening in your chest, the shallow breath, the urge to interrupt, the impulse to defend. These sensations are signals. They are your nervous system saying, we perceive threat. The threat might not be real in the present moment, but your body doesn't differentiate. It responds to perceived danger. If you ignore those signals, they drive your behavior. If you notice them, you regain choice. The simple act of slowing your breath sends a message to your nervous system that you are not in danger. That pause creates space. And in that space, you're no longer being dragged into someone else's emotional current. People on edge often communicate in extremes. Everything feels urgent to them. Everything feels personal. They speak as if something catastrophic will happen if the conversation doesn't go their way. When you absorb that urgency, you mirror it. When you don't, you disrupt it. Calm is disarming to intensity because it refuses to validate the internal chaos driving the interaction. This can feel counterintuitive. You might worry that calm makes you look indifferent. But calm is not indifference, it's confidence. It says, I'm here, but I'm not destabilized. That steadiness often forces the other person to confront their own state. Sometimes they soften. Sometimes they get louder. Either way, the imbalance becomes obvious. There's a moment in many difficult conversations where the other person tries to pull you into defending your character rather than discussing the issue at hand. They might say things like, you always do this, or this is just who you are. These statements are designed to provoke shame or self-doubt. They shift the focus from behavior to identity. This is a critical moment. If you defend your identity, you've already lost the frame. You're now arguing about who you are instead of what happened. The more you explain your intentions, the more you reinforce their narrative that you're on trial. The alternative is to redirect gently but firmly, or not engage with the identity attack at all. You can respond to identity attacks with simplicity. That's not how I see myself. And then stop. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to list evidence. Your consistency over time is the evidence. Anyone genuinely interested in understanding you will look at patterns, not isolated moments. This kind of response often frustrates people who want emotional leverage. They want you to plead your case. They want you to feel accused. When you refuse to step into that role, the interaction shifts. Sometimes it collapses. Sometimes it reveals the underlying motive. At this point, many people worry they're being passive. But passivity is avoidance. This is not avoidance. This is discernment. You are choosing where to place your energy. You're deciding not to invest it in arguments that erode your self-respect. Self-respect is not about being liked. It's about being aligned. When you act in ways that align with your values, you feel stable even in the presence of disapproval. When you chase approval at the expense of alignment, you feel anxious even when things appear calm. The more you practice this, the more you notice the difference between productive discomfort and destructive discomfort. Productive discomfort comes from growth. It stretches you, but it doesn't degrade you. Destructive discomfort comes from tolerating dynamics that undermine your dignity. Learning to tell the difference is essential. There's also a grief that surfaces as you grow more regulated. You realize how often you used to overextend just to keep others comfortable. You remember moments where you swallowed your truth to avoid tension. That grief doesn't mean you failed, it means you're aware. Awareness is the beginning of change. People who are on edge often interpret boundaries as rejection. They may accuse you of pulling away or shutting down. But a boundary is not rejection. It's a condition. It says, I can engage when it's safe and respectful. If someone can't meet that condition, the distance that follows is a consequence, not a punishment. This distinction matters because it keeps you from absorbing blame that isn't yours. You're not responsible for someone else's unwillingness to communicate in a healthy way. You are responsible for how you respond to it. There's a powerful shift that happens when you stop managing how others feel about your boundaries. At first, it's uncomfortable. You want to soften them. You want to explain your intentions. But the more you do that, the more you undermine the boundary. Boundaries don't require agreement. They require consistency. Consistency builds trust with yourself. Every time you honor a boundary, you reinforce the belief that you can protect your own well-being. That trust quiets anxiety. It reduces the urge to over-explain. It stabilizes you in moments of tension. And once you trust yourself, other people's emotional states lose their power over you. You don't rush to fix them. You don't personalize them. You observe them. You respond when appropriate and disengage when necessary. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. Clear about what's yours and what's not. Clear about where you stand. Clear about what kind of interactions you're willing to participate in. There will be moments when you do engage deeply with someone who's struggling. Moments when empathy is called for. Moments when patience is meaningful. The difference now is that these moments are choices, not obligations. You're not being pulled in. You're stepping in. And because it's a choice, you can step back out. You don't stay longer than you have capacity for. You don't sacrifice your stability to prove your care. That's the balance. As this becomes your default, something subtle but profound changes in your relationships. Conversations become more honest, less performative. You stop saying things just to keep the peace. You start saying things because they're true and measured. People learn how to approach you, not because you demand it, but because you model it. Your calm becomes a boundary. Your presence sets a tone. Some people rise to meet it. Others drift away, and you let them. Letting people drift is one of the hardest skills to develop. It goes against our instinct to hold on. But holding on to dynamics that drain you keeps you stuck in cycles that never resolve. Letting go creates space for healthier connections. This doesn't mean you never feel triggered again. You're human. But now, when you feel triggered, you recognize it as an invitation to pause rather than a command to react. You're no longer living at the mercy of every emotional surge. This is how you talk to anyone on edge without getting pulled in. You don't try to calm them, you calm yourself. You don't try to win them over. You stay rooted. You don't absorb what isn't yours. And in doing so, you protect the one thing that matters most in any interaction, your ability to be present without betraying yourself. By the time you reach this level of clarity, conversations stop feeling like battlegrounds. They stop feeling like something you have to survive. Instead, they become moments of information. You're no longer entering interactions braced for impact, scanning for threats, or rehearsing defenses in your mind before the other person even finishes a sentence. That constant internal noise quiets down, and in its place comes awareness. Awareness of what's actually being said. Awareness of what's being projected. Awareness of what belongs to you and what doesn't. One of the biggest shifts happens when you realize that not every emotional reaction requires a response. Some emotions are simply expressions of someone else's internal state. When a person is on edge, their words are often less about you and more about what they're carrying: stress, resentment, insecurity, fear. When you respond as if every emotional surge is your responsibility to manage, you place yourself in a position you were never meant to occupy. You were not designed to regulate other people's nervous systems at the expense of your own. Once you internalize that, you stop chasing emotional balance in the room. You stop trying to be the stabilizer for everyone else. You stabilize yourself and allow the rest to be what it is. That's when conversations become honest instead of performative. People on edge often rely on intensity because intensity has worked for them in the past. It may have gotten them compliance. It may have gotten them attention. It may have overwhelmed others into submission. When they encounter someone who doesn't collapse under that intensity, it disrupts the pattern. They may escalate briefly. That escalation is not failure. It's proof that the old method is no longer effective. This is where many people panic and abandon their boundaries. They mistake escalation for danger. But escalation is often just confusion. The other person is searching for the lever that used to work. When none of them do, the interaction changes. Sometimes that change leads to reflection. Sometimes it leads to distance. Both outcomes are information. Distance is not the enemy. Unconscious entanglement is. There's also a subtle power in predictability. When your responses are steady, measured, and respectful regardless of the other person's emotional state, you remove unpredictability from the interaction. And unpredictability is what fuels anxiety and control dynamics. When people know you won't explode, won't insult, won't over-explain, and won't self-abandon, they learn how to approach you differently, or they stop approaching you at all. Either way, you gain peace. You may notice that as your communication style evolves, your tolerance for chaos decreases. Things that once felt normal now feel misaligned. Raised voices, passive aggression, manipulative phrasing. You spot them sooner. You disengage faster, not because you're rigid, but because you're attuned. Attunement doesn't make you harsh, it makes you efficient. You no longer wait for conversations to spiral before you intervene internally. You notice the early signs, the tone shift, the subtle accusation, the loaded question, and instead of reacting, you pause. That pause is where your power lies. Silence, when intentional, is one of the most misunderstood tools in communication. It's not withdrawal, it's containment. It holds the moment steady long enough for clarity to surface. When someone fills every silence with pressure, your willingness to remain calm and quiet often reveals more than words ever could. This is especially true with people who are used to dominating conversations. Silence removes their momentum. It forces them to confront the impact of what they've said. Sometimes they soften. Sometimes they double down. Either response tells you what you need to know. You're no longer guessing. Another important realization is that defending yourself doesn't mean convincing someone of your innocence. Innocence doesn't need proof when you trust yourself. The need to convince often comes from doubt. When that doubt dissolves, so does the urgency to be believed by everyone. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will agree with you, and not everyone is meant to. Peace comes from releasing the expectation that understanding is always mutual. When someone insists on misunderstanding you, that's their choice. Fighting that choice keeps you entangled. Accepting it frees you. Acceptance doesn't mean agreement. It means realism. You begin to choose conversations based on capacity rather than obligation. Some days you have the bandwidth to engage thoughtfully. Some days you don't. Both are valid. You don't owe access to your energy simply because someone demands it. This is where self-trust becomes essential. Without self-trust, boundaries feel cruel. With self-trust, they feel necessary. You also start to see how often people confuse intensity with honesty. They believe that the louder emotion is the truer one. But honesty isn't measured by volume. It's measured by coherence. Calm truths tend to last longer than emotional outbursts. As you embody this, your words carry more weight. Not because they're sharper, but because they're consistent. You say less, but what you say lands. People on edge may accuse you of being detached, cold, or uncaring. Those accusations are often projections. They're responses to the discomfort of not being able to control the emotional environment. When that happens, you don't rush to correct the narrative. You know who you are. Your relationships over time reflect that truth far more accurately than a moment of accusation ever could. This is one of the hardest lessons. You don't need to correct every false story told about you. Some stories collapse under their own weight when you refuse to feed them. Energy follows attention. What you starve loses power. Over time, you may notice a shift in how you feel entering conversations that once filled you with dread. Your shoulders stay relaxed. Your breath stays steady. You listen without scanning for danger. That is not coincidence. That is practice paying off. And even when a conversation goes poorly, you recover faster. You don't replay it endlessly. You don't craft imaginary rebuttals hours later. You reflect briefly, extract what's useful, and let the rest go. Letting go is not avoidance, it's completion. Completion means you've allowed the experience to pass through without clinging to it. You've learned what there was to learn. You've felt what there was to feel. And now you move on. This is how you stop being pulled into emotional chaos, not by armor, not by detachment, but by grounded presence. You stand where you are. You speak from that place. You don't chase. You don't push. You don't shrink. And in doing so, you model a way of communicating that doesn't depend on dominance or submission. It depends on clarity. Clarity of intention, clarity of boundary, clarity of self-respect. When you have that, conversations no longer threaten your sense of self. They become exchanges, not tests. And the people who can meet you there will stay. The ones who can't won't. And for the first time, that feels less like loss and more like alignment.